Austin Box was living the dream. The Oklahoma native was playing American football for the state's biggest university on a team considered one of the best in the United States. But he started taking opioid painkillers after a back injury, kicking off an addiction that would lead to his death.
Austin was living a nightmare, the nightmare of prescription drug abuse, prescription opioids to be exact.
Austin is among the more than 400,000 Americans who have died of opioid overdoses since 1999. In a landmark ruling, a court in Oklahoma has pinned part of the blame for those deaths on the multinational Johnson & Johnson. The firm and its drug-making subsidiary Janssen have been fined $572 million to pay for treatment and prevention programs in the state.
Defendants caused an opioid crisis that is evidenced by increased rates of addiction, overdose deaths, and neonatal abstinence syndrome in Oklahoma.
Judge Bachman has affirmed our position that Johnson & Johnson, motivated by greed and avarice, is responsible for the opioid epidemic in our state. Johnson & Johnson will finally be held accountable for thousands of deaths and addiction caused by their activities.
The case is the first against opioid makers to go to trial. It initially included OxyContin maker Purdue Pharma, which settled for $270 million to avoid litigation. J&J shares rose 2% after the ruling was announced because investors were expecting a fine of up to $5 billion. But the company says it intends to appeal the ruling.
We have sympathy for all who suffer from substance abuse. But Johnson & Johnson did not cause the opioid abuse crisis here in Oklahoma or anywhere in this country.
A class action lawsuit that about 2,000 plaintiffs have filed against drug makers, distributors, and pharmacies is set to go to trial before a federal court in October. And the Oklahoma ruling is being seen as a preview of what could be a bigger victory for victims looking for justice. Paolo Montecillo, TRT World.
For more on this, Jonathan H. Marks joins us from Pennsylvania. He's the Bioethics Program Director at Penn State University. Jonathan, thanks for joining us. What is the significance of this landmark ruling and what kind of precedent could it set?
So this is a really important case. It is not the first important case this year. As you may know, several months ago, some executives at Insys, the manufacturers of another opioid, were convicted of racketeering. So, and there's been a long history of litigation against the opioid companies. This is a remarkable decision and a very important decision, as you rightly point out. But it's just one case, and there are many thousands, as you say, waiting in Ohio. What I think is remarkable about this case is the way in which, among other things, the market responded to it, which was that the share price actually went up. They had anticipated that Johnson & Johnson would be on the hook for much more than $500 million. And indeed, the judge said in the case that that $500 million, if you read the judgment, is just the costs for 1 year of abating the opioid epidemic. And of course, it's not going to take 1 year. It's going to take many, many, many years. So I think we're going to see much more activity, and we want to keep an eye on the case in Ohio, too.
Jonathan, Big Pharma is so powerful. Will this have any tangible impact, as in will it encourage companies to be more responsible with their marketing practices?
So that is also a terrific question. Unfortunately, as you may know, Purdue pleaded guilty to misleading marketing way back in 2007 of its opioid, OxyContin. And yet there is evidence before the court in Massachusetts that it continued to engage in aggressive marketing practices for another decade thereafter. So one of the questions is whether these kinds of penalties, these kinds of payments, they seem large to us, But for a company like Johnson & Johnson, relatively speaking, with billions and billions of dollars of sales, these are still relatively small amounts. So it remains to be seen whether their practices are going to change.
Do you think this will have any impact on the other cases, or perhaps how the other cases are prosecuted going forward? Will some of the other companies see this as a bit of a how-to?
So I certainly think some companies are going to think about their potential liability in future litigation and whether they should settle. Purdue dropped out of this case, having agreed to pay $270 million. Another opioid manufacturer, Teva, dropped out, having agreed to pay $85 million. But the potential liabilities are indeed in the billions. This case applies Oklahoma law. That it turned on the definition of a public nuisance under Oklahoma law. That's not the same in every other state. But I think that this case will be a signal to other companies as to their potential liability and will give them some incentive to do what the judge in Ohio wants them to do, which is to settle.
And just briefly, you did mention that Johnson & Johnson's shares didn't react negatively to this ruling. Do you expect that to continue as they say that they're going to appeal?
So I think, shareholders are going to watch this carefully. I think it's also a lesson in the morality of the markets, which is, there isn't really a morality of the market. The markets are responding as you would expect. Shareholders want to know what the value of their shares is going to be. But I think you're going to see share prices bump up and down as shareholders start to anticipate the potential liability and exposure of their company. Now, I will say, in the case of Purdue, it looks like Purdue is probably going to pursue the bankruptcy route. I think that is not going to be an attractive route for a large corporation like Johnson & Johnson. So we'll have to wait and see. But yes, you can expect the markets to bounce around. The most important question, though, is what are we going to do as a society to prevent these practices from occurring? It's one thing to hold companies liable for past wrongdoing. What are we going to do to ensure that these practices don't continue and that consumers, the public, patient health are protected from these kind of aggressive marketing practices? And I'll say one other thing, what the counsel for Johnson & Johnson is saying is that public-private partnerships are the way out of this. Well, public-private partnerships are exactly what got us into this mess. Companies like Johnson & Johnson and Purdue and others partnered with pain management groups to spread the message that opioids weren't addictive, weren't risky in terms of abuse, and were effective for long-term pain in non-terminal patients. That turned out to be a terrible message, which has cost hundreds of thousands of lives.
And certainly those cases coming up, we will be keeping an eye on. Jonathan H. Marks from Penn State University, thank you for your time.